Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Barbara Malkas, Board President of the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to the second annual Margo Simon Golden Memorial Webinar, Advocating for Health Toward a Cancer-Free Future. I am honored to be here today to serve as the moderator. And before we begin today's program, I would like to share MBCC's mission statement. Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition is dedicated to preventing the environmental causes of breast cancer through community education, research advocacy, and changes to public policy. I would also like to take a moment to tell you about the person for whom the annual event has been named, Margo Simon Golden. Many in our audience are likely already familiar with Margo, who sadly passed away 1 year ago. Margo served in my role as board president for over a decade. She was a tireless advocate for and believer in the mission statement I just shared with you. Moreover, she was a compassionate ally and friend to so many in the MBCC community. And she is missed by all who knew her, personally and professionally. We are honored to have Margo's family with us today as we honor her legacy. With a lively discussion on a topic so important to her, followed by the presentation of an award in her name. Before we begin, I would like to hold a moment of silence to honor and remember Margo. Please join me. Thank you. I'm very proud to introduce our distinguished panel for today's webinar. Dr. Arlene Blum is the Executive Director of the Green Science Policy Institute and a Research Associate in Chemistry at UC Berkeley. The Institute's scientific research and policy work with government and business has reduced the use of classes of harmful chemicals, including flame retardants and fluorinated chemicals in consumer products worldwide. Welcome, Dr. Blum.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here. And I'd like to
go. Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Blum.
I said thank you so much. I'm honored to be here. And I just realized I forgot how to share my slides. Can somebody remind me? Sorry.
You have a few moments. I'm going to introduce our other panelists.
Oh, you're giving everybody. Okay. And one
we'll help you with that.
Thank you. Sorry.
Dr. Laurel Schaider is a senior scientist at Silent Spring Institute. Her research focuses on PFAS chemicals in drinking water, consumer products, and food. And she also studies environmental justice disparities in drinking water quality. She is the lead investigator of the Massachusetts PFAS and Your Health study, part of a broader CDC-funded multi-site study. She also leads PFAS REACH, which is studying PFAS immunotoxicity in children and developing resources to support communities affected by PFAS contamination. And she is part of the University of Rhode Island's STEEP Superfund research program. Welcome, Dr. Schaider.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Dr. Malkas.
And Dr. Maricel Maffini is an environmental health scientist, independent consultant. She has more than 25 years of research experience in the fields of carcinogenesis and breast cancer in particular, reproductive biology and endocrine disruption. For the past 10 years, her work has focused on the safety and regulation of chemicals in food and decision-making process behind them. Welcome, Dr. Maffini.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
We'll have each panelist give their presentation, and then we'll hold a Q&A session. Please feel free to submit your questions in the question section of the menu to the right side of your screen. Let's begin with Dr. Blum.
Thank you so much. Let's see, I can show my screen. Let's see. Okay. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about PFAS in food packaging, what you should know and what you can do. And I'm from the Green Science Policy Institute. We're scientists who write papers, bring decision makers together to affect change and communicate what we learn widely in order to affect changes both in government policy and also in business and manufacturing purchasing practices. As we all know, there's tens of thousands of chemicals, and sometimes it can seem daunting. It can take years to evaluate the toxicity of a chemical, years of advocacy when a chemical is phased out after it's found to be harmful. The usual substitute is a chemical that's very similar in structure, function, and unfortunately, toxicity. So a group of us got together, people from academia, business, government, NGOs who really cared about solving this problem and came up with the idea of sorting chemicals into families or classes with similar characteristics as a way of thinking about these tens of thousands of chemicals, and came up with 6 classes or families that contain the majority, not all, but a big chunk of the harmful chemicals that we find in everyday chemicals and that end up in us and end up causing cancer and other health harm. So these are the 6 classes: PFAS, antimicrobials, flame retardants, plasticizers, some solvents, certain metals. And if people have interest, they can go to sixclasses.org, watch a 4-minute video on each of the 6 classes, learn where they're used, why they're harmful, and ways to reduce exposure. So I'm going to talk today about the class of PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. These are chains of carbon surrounded by fluorine. And in some ways, I would say they're my favorite of the 6 classes because they're the best and the worst. They're good in that they have useful functions, provide oil and water repellency, but they are forever chemicals. The carbon-fluorine bond is the strongest bond in the periodic table. It never breaks. PFAS, when they're in the environment, they last forever. They stay a long time in people's bodies. And the ones that have been well studied have all been found to be harmful. Indeed, PFAS are multi-system toxicants. There have been now animal studies and in some cases human epidemiological studies finding harm, wide variety of systems and organs from PFAS exposure. Just a reminder, if you haven't seen Dark Waters, a wonderful film with the story of a massive PFAS contamination in West Virginia. We really recommend it as a very entertaining introduction to PFAS. So as I said, when a chemical is phased out, there's often a regrettable and similar chemical. In the case of PFAS, for years, the chemicals were called C8s, 8 carbons surrounded by fluorine. They were called the long chain. They finally stopped manufacturing in 2015 in the US due to their extreme persistence, that they bioaccumulate, they're toxic. And unfortunately, the substitute was C6, very similar properties. They don't last as long in humans, but they build up in plants, they move fast, and cleanup is more difficult because filtration of water that takes out the long chain, the short chain can often go through, and there's so many of them. We at our institute, talking about classes, we wrote a paper on the scientific basis for managing all PFAS as a class, and this is a way of thinking about them. The number keeps changing, 8 or 10,000 different PFAS. So what about PFAS exposure? Well, some studies have found that food now, if your community has contaminated drinking water, that would be the largest source. But for people without contaminated drinking water, food is by far the largest source. And the PFAS in our diets can come both from the food and from packaging leaching into the food. Where are PFAS used? They're used all kinds of places in food packaging: cartons, liners, bags, flexible packaging, support cards, and they're used in snack foods, cake mixes, margarine, candy, bakery products, meat, pet food, and more. The FDA inventory of food contact notifications, if you search for fluoro, shows the greatest uses are water repellents for paper and board, and also from food processing equipment, some polymer processing additives, and some other uses. So how do they get into the food? There have been a few papers showing transfer from food contact material to foods. And the amount of transfer depends on what PFAS it is, how fatty the food is, temperature, and contact time. So a lot of food packaging can contain PFAS. So these kind of clamshell boxes here made of organic materials will also sometimes have as much as 20% by weight PFAS in addition to the organic materials. And it's not just the boxes themselves that are harmful, it's the whole life cycle. There's the manufacturing of the PFAS, during which it can escape into water and air locally and impact nearby communities. There's the paper mills where the paper is made, and the PFAS can end up in water and sludge, and once again, harm local residents. Then there's the carton, the packaging, and then at the end of life, the useful life of the package, it can end up in landfill where it can leach out into water, landfill leachate. It can be composted, and there was a time when organic compost could contain these supposedly packaging that was a lot of PFAS, but organic packaging for the last years has had limits, so that there cannot be PFAS in it anymore. And then when the container is recycled, it can end up back in product. You have to think about the whole life cycle, not just the container. Water treatment is really expensive. For example, in North Carolina, a Chemours plant contaminated the Cape Fear region, and to build an activated carbon filtration plant, $46 million, nearly $3 million a year to operate, but to get rid of a whole witch's brew of PFAS that they have from the Chemours plant, reverse osmosis is much more effective, and that plant is twice as much to build and a similar amount to operate for only 25,000 customers. Out of that, we can say PFAS are problematic, difficult, perhaps impossible to clean up thoroughly when they're out in the environment. Prevention is preferable, and prevention means stopping their use in products. A lot of the uses of PFAS turn out to not be necessary. The Keen shoe story is an example. PFAS were found in 101 places in Keen shoes. When they looked carefully, they're water shoes. They don't need PFAS. And 2/3 of the places, the PFAS were not necessary and were removed immediately. It took years of work and quite a lot of money to find replacements for the other 31, but they succeeded. So Keen shoes don't have any PFAS. Carpeting used to be the highest exposure place for children because they crawl in a carpet that's treated with PFAS, put their hands in their mouths, and carpet was really problematic. However, the carpet industry made a decision to stop using PFAS, and most have phased it out as of January 1st, 2020. So, and this was an industry, we worked with them, helped educate them, and they decided, partly based on good values, probably partly based on concern about lawsuits from the communities downriver from Dalton, Georgia, where most of our carpets manufactured, they did make a decision to stop adding PFAS, and most of the major manufacturers have. We wrote a paper finding fluorinated compounds in about half the cosmetics we tested, particularly things like waterproof mascara, shiny foundation, shiny liquid lipstick. And from these products, there's direct paths into people through tear ducts, inhalation, ingestion. We worked with people in the House and the Senate on No PFAS in Cosmetics Act that were bipartisan. Nationally, those did not pass. However, last September, the state of California passed the PFAS-Free Cosmetics Act, banning the intentional addition of PFAS to beauty and personal care products in California. And this is likely to be followed across the US. So this is a big prevention to stop this sort of exposure. So if you're interested in PFAS, like we are, we have a website, PFAS Central, you can go to that has the latest news, science, events, everything PFAS. And our most popular page is our PFAS-free page. Requests of communities who've been near PFAS production plants, military bases, airports, where they've been exposed to PFAS in their drinking water. They asked if we could put together lists of PFAS-free products. And so one can get these lists. We keep updating them, and it's a way to help avoid exposure. So please contact me if you have any questions, and you can learn more on our websites, Green Science Policy, PFAS Central, and 6 classes. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blum. And before we move on to our next panelist, I just want to remind our participants who are online with us that if you have any questions, you can throw them into the question feature on your side panel for this webinar at any time. So thank you for that. And we'll pass it on now to Dr. Schaider.
Great. Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate this opportunity to be with MBCC again for the second annual Margo Simon Golden Memorial Webinar. Thanks, Dr. Malkas, for the introduction, and to Dr. Blum for your informative introductory presentation. This webinar is really a great way to honor Margo's legacy by extending MBCC's education and advocacy work. So I'm going to talk a bit about PFAS in textile consumer products. I'm going to highlight a paper that Silent Spring Institute published last year on PFAS in children's products in their everyday lives. Talk about some recent updates from retailers, from state legislatures, and from green certifiers, and end with some things that you can do and some helpful resources. So as Arlene said, PFAS are common in our everyday lives, and even if PFAS is not a familiar term for people, everyone has products in their homes that contain PFAS. Many of these products are textile-based products, and you may have seen headlines over the past year finding evidence of PFAS in yoga pants, menstrual underwear, and school uniforms. So the study that I'm going to talk about, we published last year, and we wanted to focus on textile products frequently used by children and adolescents. And we wanted to focus on children and adolescents because they may be particularly sensitive to the harmful effects of PFAS chemicals, which Arlene already went through what some of those harmful effects are, and because we know that PFAS are widely used in many different types of textiles. Our paper did receive quite a bit of worldwide media coverage, and as I'll talk about, it has informed policy changes as well. So what do we hope to learn from our study? We wanted to identify which types of everyday textile products for children were most likely to contain PFAS. We did the chemical testing in a couple of different ways, looking both at total fluorine and looking for specific targeted PFAS compounds. We wanted to learn more about the types and the levels of PFAS present in these products. And we also wanted to evaluate whether information on product labels could help consumers select products without PFAS. If you look at a product label, it doesn't usually say whether or not it contains PFAS, but we wondered whether products that had stain or water resistant claims were more likely to contain PFAS, and whether green assurances or certifications or just green language, you can buy products that say things like non-toxic, whether any of those were helpful in finding products that were less likely to contain PFAS. So broadly speaking, we were looking at apparel, bedding, and furnishings. And we picked these categories of items because we really wanted to focus on products that children and adolescents have frequent contact with in their homes. So from our study, we found that PFAS were found in many of the textile products that we tested. When we purchased products, we wanted to make sure that we were including a number of products that did have some sort of stain and water resistant assurances on their product labels. And we also included products that did or did not have green assurances. So we did find that products that said they were water or stain resistant were more likely to contain PFAS, especially those that had some sort of a trademark name on them, like Scotchgard. And stain-resistant products overall were more likely to contain PFAS than water-resistant products. What we did find too in terms of the green certifications was that that wasn't necessarily helpful at identifying products that were less likely to contain PFAS. And that wasn't necessarily surprising to us. These certifications usually focused on limiting other types of harmful chemicals, and they weren't written to restrict PFAS as a class. And when they did have PFAS restrictions on them, they often had limits that were much higher than the ones we were testing for in the study. So they were still useful, but not necessarily to help identify products that were less likely to contain PFAS. As Arlene said, many of the long-chain PFAS have been phased out of production in the US and have been replaced by alternative compounds such as shorter-chain PFAS. And the products that we tested, and these were all purchased in 2020, we did find both the newer alternative PFAS chemicals as well as some of the longer-chain legacy PFAS compounds. So what are some of the implications of this finding? As a consumer, as an advocate trying to reduce your reliance on PFAS-containing products? Certainly avoiding products when you can that say that they're water or stain resistant may help. Certainly there are other ways that a product such as a mattress pad might be made waterproof, so it doesn't necessarily mean that a product contains PFAS. But relying on a product label alone is not going to be a reliable indicator. And of course, we shouldn't rely on consumers to have to be thinking about toxic chemicals when they're at the store buying products for their families. I also wanted to mention that when we looked at total fluorine, which provides an indication of the total amount of PFAS in the products, we found that there was a lot more fluorine in there than we could account for with the PFAS that we were able to extract out of those products. And that's not necessarily surprising. We know that a lot of the PFAS might be present as large polymer compounds that are not necessarily mobile or likely to come out of a product in the short term. But it does suggest that there are PFAS that are present in these products that we are not currently accounting for with commonly used measurement methods. So you might be wondering, okay, why does it matter? These products have some amounts of PFAS in them. You know, why should we be concerned? We know that we can be exposed to PFAS in many different ways, and these exposures all add up. So when we're talking about these types of everyday household items where the PFAS really aren't serving an essential life-saving type of function, it's an easy way to avoid unnecessary exposure by avoiding products like these that have PFAS. It's also important to consider the whole life cycle. So even if individuals might not be worried about their own personal exposure, it's important to think about the whole life cycle, particularly in communities around the manufacturing plants where these chemicals are manufactured. There can often be high levels of PFAS in that local environment. We also know that PFAS are called forever chemicals because they don't readily break down. So PFAS from textiles can end up in laundry water when items are washed. Those can end up in wastewater and end up getting out into the environment. And then when a product is disposed of after its useful life, it can end up in a landfill. And from there, PFAS can migrate into groundwater or end up at a wastewater treatment plant. Wastewater treatment plants can't break down PFAS, and so those chemicals can end up being discharged into the environment through effluent or through sludge or biosolids. So I wanted to mention that there is actually quite a bit happening related to PFAS and consumer products, particularly at the state level. So I wanted to highlight a few examples of what's happening in other states. So in 2021, the state of Maine passed the world's first ban on products with PFAS. And so this bill had a couple of different components to it. It will ban the sale of all products containing PFAS by the year 2030. There are some exceptions for uses of PFAS that are essential for health or safety or the functioning of society where there aren't reasonably available alternatives. In the shorter term, just at the beginning of this year, this bill also requires the disclosure of products that contain PFAS. So manufacturers have to disclose the purpose and the amounts of PFAS in products that are for sale in the state of Maine. And this bill also included a ban on the sale of new carpets and fabric treatments with intentionally added PFAS. In California, Arlene mentioned that there was a bill last year to ban PFAS in cosmetics. And there was another bill that banned PFAS in apparel and upholstery as well. And those take effect in 2025. And then just 2 weeks ago, a bill was signed by the governor of New York to ban PFAS chemicals from clothing, apparel and clothing, and that would be take effect by the end of this year, 2023. So there's kind of a lot happening in different states all across the country. Retailers are also making commitments to stop using PFAS. So I listed a few examples here, like Levi's, Patagonia. These may apply to all of their products or some of their products that contain PFAS. And I found a helpful list of others on the Breast Cancer Prevention Partners website as well. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about certifiers as well. So I mentioned that in our study, we didn't necessarily see that products that had a sort of certification were less likely to contain PFAS. And there's actually been quite a bit of activity on this since last year, since our paper came out. Several of the largest certifiers, so Ecotex, BlueSign, and ZBHC, have adopted policies or committed to making policies such that their standards will no longer allow for intentionally added PFAS. The Ecotex standards also have a fairly strict level of the total organofluorine present in products that meet some of their standards. And this is really significant. These certifiers work with tens of thousands of different companies. So this is really an important step forward for limiting PFAS in products and helping consumers take steps to avoid purchasing products that contain PFAS. And I wanted to mention that the organization Safer States has done a lot to help translate the findings of our study and other research to bring those results to the certifiers to take this step forward. So what are some things that you can do? Well, there are things that in our everyday lives we can do to reduce our reliance on harmful chemicals like PFAS. Certainly if you're buying new clothing or furniture, try to skip having stain-resistant coatings. You can let retailers know that you want safer products. If you are in charge of purchasing, say for your workplace or maybe in your town or for your school district, that kind of institutional buying power can really magnify the effects that we can have as consumers, as individuals. Certainly we can take steps to learn about and support stricter chemical safety testing to avoid this type of issue happening in the future where we put chemicals into products before they've been thoroughly vetted for safety. We hope that you'll learn and share information about avoiding toxics, for instance, from webinars such as this. And it's important to stay up to date about state and local legislation. The MBCC website is a great place to help stay on top of what's happening here in Massachusetts. In the past legislative session, there were bills that were introduced to ban PFAS in some consumer products and limit PFAS in children's products. And my understanding is that in the next legislative cycle that a broader bill will be introduced to restrict PFAS in consumer products, and that the Toxic Kids Act will also be reintroduced that would limit PFAS and other toxic chemicals in children's products. If you haven't already, please also check out Silent Spring Institute's Detox Me smartphone app, which provides many tips and suggestions for avoiding PFAS and other toxic chemicals in your daily life. I'll also mention two other resources. So one is the PFAS Exchange, which was developed by our PFAS Reach study. It's a multifaceted online resource center. It has fact sheets on to address commonly asked questions such as PFAS health effects, PFAS in drinking water. We provide information about medical screening guidance that we developed together with several clinicians. And we also developed a continuing medical education course to help physicians and other clinicians learn about PFAS and to improve patient care. We have a data interpretation tool to help users better understand and provide context for the results of any water or blood testing that they may have received. And with our partners at Northeastern University, we also have developed a map. We were calling the Connecting Communities map, with information about contamination sites from the Northeastern Contamination Site Tracker, with information about community groups and with state action. And I'll mention that Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition is a partner on our PFAS REACH study, as well as our other federally funded PFAS health studies in Massachusetts. Another place to find resources on PFAS is the URI STEEP Superfund Research Program, which is an interdisciplinary research study led by University of Rhode Island together with Harvard and Silent Spring Institute. And together with the researchers, there's also Research Translation Corps and Community Engagement Corps to extend and bring that work to many different communities and audiences. So with that, again, I'd like to thank MBCC for the invitation to be here today and for holding this great event. And I wanted to share a couple of photos of Margo Simon Golden. I fondly remember navigating the halls of the State House for meetings with legislators to talk about PFAS and other toxic chemicals. Margo was a tireless advocate for Silent Spring Institute and for improving the health of people here in Massachusetts and beyond. So I'm so grateful to have known her and for her quiet and fierce determination to make the world a better place. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schaider. A brief reminder, once again, if questions come up as these panelists are presenting, please put them in the chat so we'll be able to ensure that your answer gets answered in the Q&A. And now we'll turn it over to Dr. Maffini.
All right. Okay, can you see the screen?
Yes.
Yes, Dr. Maffini.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's been an honor to be part of this prestigious panel and for the invitation again by the MBCC. It's always a pleasure to collaborate with them and to help them further their very worthy goals. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I've done when it comes to food. There we go. So thank you, Arlene and Laurel, for your introduction to the chemicals. I wanted to start mentioning the two main areas where PFAS come from. And one is, as Arlene mentioned at the beginning, the direct addition of these chemicals into the manufacturing of specific products for a specific function, like grease proofing or waterproofing. There is a second addition as a processing aid in the manufacturing of certain plastics materials, like bottles and other consumer products, where PFAS are added to prevent to make the product smooth and to be released from molds in a more easier way, so there's no stickiness to the molds that are used, like here in this bottle here on the left-hand side corner. But there is another way that PFAS, there's another source of PFAS that we have learned in the last few years, that is during the manufacturing of plastics. Specifically, plastics are blasted with fluorine gas to prevent that the bottles, like it shows here on the bottom right, the middle bottle, to actually be able to resist different pressure from the inside and the outside, and also to increase to decrease the permeability of the bottle, so no fumes or other things are moving out of the bottles. So we have learned in the last few years that this process that has been around for quite some time is actually a source of PFAS as well. So because when PFAS are used in contact with food, FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, is in charge of regulating those uses. And FDA has a standard of safety. That means that the PFAS or any other chemical that is used in food, added directly or are in contact with food, has to be reasonable certainty that it will cause no harm under the intended conditions of use. So FDA has authorized many different uses of PFAS in contact with food, from your typical popcorn, microwavable popcorn bags, all the way to this particular carry-on containers and parts of equipment that is used in the manufacturing of food as well. So I want to make sure we, as both Arlene and Laurel mentioned, industries where PFAS have been removed. And as Arlene said, long chain PFAS are usually the worst of all of them. I want to mention that long chain PFAS have been removed from uses in contact with food since 2016. So that was as in response to an effort by NGOs that had requested FDA to ban their uses because of they are unsafe. Later on in 2018 and later, FDA's own scientists showed that also those short chain PFAS that look like they were replacements and they look a little better, less toxic and the like, but they have other problems, also show that they are bioaccumulating in the body. And there is a commitment made by some of the manufacturers with FDA to phase out those uses in contact with food as well. So there has been some progress made and in the PFAS front in contact with food, but we have more work to do. So I want to mention this new, not new, but what we have learned in the last few years about the use of fluorinated plastic. Specifically, polyethylene plastic is fluorinated to make a barrier around the walls of the plastics to make it more impermeable and reduces the exchange of oxygen and moisture. Therefore, the content of in the container can last longer, is not oxidized as easily. So FDA has approved this methodology in 1983. What does it mean that the plastic is fluorinated and where the PFAS are coming from? Without digging much into the chemistry, what happens is that fluorine gas in combination with nitrogen or other inert gas are blasted to the plastic where these hydrogens molecules here that you see on the left-hand side, those hydrogens are being replaced by fluorine molecules. And in the presence of oxygen or water, those new chemistries can be released in the form of PFAS. And these PFAS, now we know that can be released from the plastic. So these are two examples of how the fluorination occurs. It could be a container that is already made, a plastic container, and then it is put in a chamber in contact with the fluorine gas and nitrogen gas, and it fluorinates both the inside and the outside of the plastic. And then there's a second process where during the molding of a container, the fluorine gas is injected inside the mold, and it is only fluorinated the inside of the container. So as I said, FDA approved these technologies in 1983. without knowing at the time what a PFAS was, but it has been used for many, many decades now, and mostly the approval is for polyethylene plastic, but we have seen that companies are using it for other types of plastics that would not apply to these regulations, so they would be apparently breaking the law. And FDA also approved that after the fluorination, the content of the fluorinated plastic container could have up to 5,000 parts per billion of fluorine in the food. So that is problematic. And when I briefly mentioned that those PFAS that are created during the fluorination of the plastics are released, that information first came from EPA that was alerted by a group and in Massachusetts, and the Department of Environment in Massachusetts also alerted EPA because they found PFAS in pesticides that were widely applied in the state. So EPA did their own investigation, and they realized that the source of the PFAS was the plastic container and not the pesticide itself. So they have identified all these many different PFAS from the long chains. Here it means that it has 11 carbon in the chain, all the way to molecules with 4 carbons are considered short chains. So this was, they identified all these many PFAS just by using 1 milliliter of methanol and rinse the container for a minute. So you can identify many of them, and you can remove quite a bit by just 1 minute of contact of the plastic with methanol. So just towards the end of last year, EPA did another set of studies where they actually use, again, methanol that can be more kind of aggressive, and it will remove more of these chemicals, but also with water, just simple water, and at different times, up to 20 weeks. And this is just how many of different PFAS they found in water that was left alone for, in this case, 20 weeks in a container that had been fluorinated. So again, they found all these 4 long chain PFAS. And why that is a problem? EPA has a regulation that long chain PFAS are subject to and enforced by EPA's Toxic Substances Control Act. So they identified this problem, and then they basically told in the industry, whomever is using these technologies and doing these things, that they have to report to EPA, ask permission, and EPA has to actually authorize those uses, because otherwise they are not in compliance with the law. Now, when EPA released the first set of information in 2020, FDA started looking at their practices, and they also identified problems, and they also released a letter to the manufacturers indicating that unless the manufacturers are following strictly the regulations, they are not, they are actually breaking the law as well. That they may only be manufactured by modifying the surface of the molded container using fluorine gas in combination with the nitrogen. That is the strict language. And any other plastic that is not polyethylene and any other gas combination with fluorine would be unlawful. So how do we know, again, that they get into food? Well, a few weeks ago, at the end of 2022, the end of December, The Guardian published this article about a study that is going to come out soon, where these PFAS were found in food containers, and they were coming from the fluorination of the plastic. And at the same time, the article also reported on new lawsuits. There are 2 lawsuits going on a company called Enhance that is based in Houston, Texas, that produces the fluorination of plastics. It's one of the manufacturers of these plastics. And they are really used in many different things, including food, but cosmetics and automobile articles, pesticides, and the like. So the latest developments when it comes to the fluorination of plastics and the generation of PFAS from those plastics is the December 27 lawsuit by the Center for Environmental Health and the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility group that is from Massachusetts. That is the one that alerted the EPA the first time when they found PFAS in the pesticide in the pesticides. So these 2 groups are suing Enhanced Technologies because they are fluorination of plastics and the creation of PFAS. EPA has also filed a lawsuit against the company. And when it comes to prevention of this contamination of food with PFAS from fluorinated plastics, we are in the process of preparing a food additive petition to the agency, to FDA, asking to revoke that approval from 1983 to fluorinate polyethylene to be used in contact with food. So again, why should you care about this? As it was mentioned earlier, this long chain PFAS and some of the short chains accumulate in the body. They resist and persist in the environment forever. We are already exposing the unborn children to these PFAS because they cross placenta. And there are so many of these uses that are non-essential. But what is very interesting to me is that when you look at the Environmental Protection Agency's latest lifetime drinking water health advisory for the 2 most famous and infamous long-chain PFAS, PFOA and PFOS, EPA said that what would be, in quotation marks, a safe amount of these chemicals is in the parts per quadrillion level. I don't know, I can't figure out how many zeros there is in this number, but what I can tell you is that, in my opinion, that means that there is effectively no safe level of this PFAS. And we have to do as much as we can to turn off the tap on their uses. And we definitely need more information on how to identify those sources to continue pressing regulatory agencies to eliminate some of those unnecessary uses. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maffini. We're going to have our fellow panelists join us here for the Q&A. Hello, welcome back. I have a few questions that have already been posed by our listeners to this webinar. And the first question I'm going to direct towards you, Dr. Blum. There recently was a study released regarding the consumption of freshwater fish from PFAS contaminated water, equaling a month's level of exposure through drinking water alone. And so the person who raised this question referenced PCBs. And I remember 25, 30 years ago, right? We heard a lot about PCBs as an industrial waste product. And basically what was ultimately determined was that as long as the sediment in that region remains undisturbed, that the water itself was relatively safe and that consumption of fish in those waters would not necessarily lead to PCB contamination. Yet we're hearing from all three of our panelists today that PFAS is everywhere, and our level of exposure is and possible exposure could be from multiple sources. What's the difference, both chemically for the layman and from an understanding of toxicity, is the difference between what we learned about PCBs back then and PFAS today?
So I'm not an expert on this, so others could chime in, but I would guess that the PCBs are stickier and they stick more to the sediment, while the PFAS isn't so sticky. It's more hydrophobic, and it is up in the water where the fish are absorbing it more. So that would be my surmise. I don't know if what Laurel or Maricel thinks about that.
Yeah, I think you're right on there with that, Arlene, that PCBs do tend to stick to sediments. They do tend to accumulate in fish, and they probably bioaccumulate more and biomagnify, and that refers to chemicals that increase in concentration as you go up the food chain. I think the challenge about PFAS is that they do, some of them do accumulate in fish in that way, but they're also very mobile in water, and they're also in all these consumer products. So we just get exposed in a lot of different ways, and they're much more of a water contamination issue and a drinking water issue than PCBs are. Again, because they, like you said, exactly, they're stickier, and so they do accumulate in fish and sediment, but not as much, not as mobile in the water and in groundwater.
Yeah, PCBs were mostly an inadvertent contamination, and they were used, in electrical condensers and things like that, but not used in everyday products. So we people don't get that exposure from their products or their containers that Maricel was telling us about. So many routes, unfortunately, of PFAS to people.
And we think of PCBs as a class as well, but it is a much smaller class. There are only about 216 PCBs, and they're a lot more chemically similar to each other. PFAS, my latest count from the EPA website is that there's over 12,000, and I think depending on how you define it, there might be many more. So it's hard to generalize about PFAS because there's so many different properties, and some are more mobile and some can biomagnify to a greater degree. So it's just a much bigger challenge.
And I will just add that one big problem with PFAS, PCBs, and flame retardants is that they stay around so long. And PCBs were actually banned back when we had TSCA first passed in the 70s. And yet they continue to be like a big problem. Like the killer whales in Puget Sound are possibly not able to reproduce because of PCBs that were banned in the 70s. So it's a big decision to start using chemicals that are around for centuries or forever, and not using them is the best solution, as we're discussing today.
Thank you, Dr. Blum. Dr. Schaider, it seems that heat-resistant materials have been treated with PFAS. And so what is the mechanism by which, everyone understands exposure, but what's the mechanism by which they are then, we can kind of understand with drinking water or with eating that once it's ingested, it's now part of a system and can be, absorbed into tissue. How is the exposure through textiles and other materials external to the body, the skin, what is the mechanism by which they are getting into the system and then leading to these toxic and potentially carcinogenic effects?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we don't fully know the answer to that question, but we know some of the possible pathways. So one thing that might come to your mind immediately is if you have, say, clothing that has PFAS, can any of that get through your skin? And I'd say that the jury is still out. There's some initial evidence that there is not a lot of absorption through the skin, but I think that's pretty limited evidence. And I haven't delved into this, but I think there's some more recent evidence to suggest that some PFAS can be absorbed through the skin. So, and maybe Arlene or Maricel know more about that. So that's one possible pathway. When you're talking about kids, especially young kids, you have to think about their hands being in their mouth. So if they are touching products, touching carpet, eating snack, their hands are in their mouth, and they suck on their clothes. And so there's a lot of ways, especially for kids, that where they could have special or specific exposure pathways. And then a couple of other pathways. So we don't think of dust as sort of an aesthetic nuisance in our house. We try to vacuum so that our house looks clean, but it's actually a repository for toxic chemicals in our homes. Toxic chemicals can stick to that dust, and we don't think about ingesting dust every day, but we all ingest, I think it's about 250 milligrams of dust a day. And so if PFAS and fibers from textiles ends up in that dust, that can be an exposure pathway. There's also a pathway through indoor air. So some PFAS are volatile, so that means they can actually enter the air in our homes. So we can breathe them in. That's another exposure pathway. They can also get into the air and then stick to dust and then get into our bodies that way. So there's a few different exposure pathways for textiles and clothing.
And once it's in the body, like what is the mechanism by which it becomes this cancer causing agent?
I think that is also another area where there's still a lot that's still not known. Broadly speaking, PFAS exposures have been linked to many harmful health effects. Pretty much every system in the body seems to be affected by PFAS. One thought is that for some health outcomes like elevated cholesterol, that if you look at a PFAS compound and you look at a fatty acid, that they might look similar. It's just you have fluorines instead of hydrogen. So it's thought that there might be some disruption there in terms of those pathways. And others who are more in the toxicology side of things might know more, but I think there's still a lot that we don't know specifically about how PFAS, say, can affect our immune system. There's certainly evidence of different receptors in the body where PFAS can bind and have an effect, but there's still a lot that we don't know, and different PFAS chemicals have slightly different chemical structures and may interact with different parts of our bodies differently.
Yeah, one thing, can you hear me? I cannot see anybody, so I apologize if I look weird on camera. I cannot see myself or any of you. But what I would add is that for the short chain PFAS, for instance, FDA has indicated that they could be causing cancer not by breaking the DNA or by causing mutations, but for other means. It's not clear what the other pathways may be, but that is a very important difference, because when FDA asks companies to test for potential cancer-causing properties of the packaging chemicals, they only look at whether or not the DNA breaks down or they cause mutations. Now we have another path that may not be toxic to our genome, but it will be equally causing cancer.
Yeah, that's a great point. And just to build on that, in the case of breast cancer, we do think that chemicals can cause breast cancer in different ways. And one of the pathways that we're concerned about are chemicals that can affect mammary gland development. And so most PFAS haven't been studied for their ability to affect mammary gland development, but PFOA, which is one of the most commonly found long chain PFAS, can alter mammary gland development. And we think that that is one possible pathway to increase breast cancer risk.
Thank you. We do have a question for you, Maricel. What is the scope of foods, including cooking oils, chemicals, and other products that could be stored in the products that could be stored in fluorinated plastic containers? So I think this question is like, how broad of an issue is it that we have these PFAS fluorinated generated plastics being used as food containers?
Yeah, it is unclear. This company in Heinz that is being sued, they said that they fluorinate all different types of containers, and they don't know what their clients use it for. But they added as examples, for instance, concentrated flavors, flavoring substances, and fragrances. So anything that is oily, that you don't want it to spoil because of the moisture or an oxygen that goes through the walls of the plastic, those would be a problem. So cooking oils, definitely, I would probably say the larger volume, like for restaurants, like 5 gallons or 10 gallons. The supply chain, apparently, it makes use of these fluorinated drums as well. So we will not know where the food ingredients or chemicals used for food packagings that are moved through the supply chain using these plastic, fluorinated plastic containers, where they end up. But what I would say is that definitely the oils are an issue. We don't really know exactly where they are because there are very, very few studies. And I'm really looking forward to the study that was mentioned in The Guardian.
So when we studied cosmetic products, a number of green cosmetic companies were horrified that we found fluorine in their products because they clearly did not want it. And we did talk about it possibly leaching from containers. So I think, you know, the wholesale large containers of the ingredients could be a place. Would the smaller packaging, it wouldn't be in the smaller cosmetic packaging, it would be more along the supply chain, the big containers?
I think it could be in the final packaging for cosmetics as well.
Wow.
We have heard some of those issues through the industry at large, some of those concerns.
How unfortunate. Yeah, those companies were so upset. They had no idea. So you solved it, but and it can
right.
Be solved.
Some of the personal care products are very expensive, and you don't want it to spoil. So my bet is on those. And the other point I wanted to make is that they are fluorinating high-density polyethylene, and that is probably the most commonly recycled plastic. And it is, if you imagine your shampoo or your laundry detergent and softener, whatever you use to do laundry, that hard plastic is likely fluorinated. So we are talking about a recycled stream that is, in my opinion, going to be found incredibly contaminated with PFAS. So if we are using that recycled plastic to make other products, we are just perpetuating this problem and making it like a snowball.
I have a question that really all of you will be able to answer, and it's really directed to all three of you. When manufacturers say they have a type of PFAS that doesn't stay in the human body as long as others, what is the time scale they're using?
Well, you know, that has been the main argument of the chemical industry. Like we wrote back in 2015, we wrote the Madrid statement calling for stopping the use of the whole class of PFAS, signed by several hundred scientists. And the chemical industry wrote back and said, well, the short chains are no problem because they don't stay in your body very long. And then we wrote a rebuttal and they wrote a rebuttal, and their only argument was they don't stay in your body as long. Now, if you're being exposed every day from your drinking water or your mascara or whatever, it doesn't matter if they don't stay in your body so long. And they still, the time frame for the half-life, it's called, what's the amount of time for half of it to move away? And some of the short, you know, even if it's a few days and you're being exposed, you have a PFAS exposure. The very long chains that stay in your body for years or decades are worse, but they're all problematic. So it's a pretty bogus argument. And I just had to jump in because we just heard it over and over self-righteously from the chemical producers. No problem. They don't stay in your body so long. And of course, there certainly is a problem.
Yeah, my counter to that statement is that if you're pregnant, any day is too long to have PFAS in your body.
And are there established half-lives for PFAS or different chemicals within that grouping?
Yeah, so the C8s, the 8-chain long chains, which is what we used to use, had years as the half-life. And then you only get rid of half, and then it's more years. So, they're in your body for a big chunk of your life. Kids crawled on the carpet and put their hands in their mouths. They had PFAS till they were adults. The short chains, it's more like days, weeks, or months, and it depends on the specific one. But again, if you're exposed all the time, it doesn't matter. And even if it's months, there's still some left. And as Maricel said, the levels that are safe are just infinitesimal. So any PFAS, I think, is too much, not only for pregnant women, but really for children and for all of us. So I don't think it's much better, the short chain, in my opinion. And they have a bunch of drawbacks. There are lots more of them. They're harder to capture, harder to deal with. So it's not really an improvement, though the chemical industry sold pretty much the whole manufacturing sector. Oh yeah, maybe there was a little problem with C8, but just use C6, it'll be fine. And everybody went to C6 at great extent.
It took FDA a long time, and after being deceived by one of the big companies saying that the short chains were fine, to identify the short chain, and their estimation of the half-life, it would be a year. So there is no much separation, in my opinion, between the C8s and the C6 and the shorter.
And just one more thing I'll add, because the long chains had such a long half-life, on the order of years, industry likes to say, like, oh, the newer ones have a short half-life, and it's shorter, but I wouldn't say that it's short. For those of you who watch MBCC webinars, I'm sure you've heard of bisphenol A, or BPA, which has raised many concerns, and can buy all kinds of BPA-free products. It's kind of a discussion for another day about regrettable substitution, but BPA itself has raised a high level of concern, and that can stay in your body for hours. The concern is that we do get exposed all the time. So that's a much shorter half-life. So half-life isn't everything.
So we had an interesting question, and again, for all of our panelists today, there was an announcement from 3M that they plan to phase out PFAS. Since they're so widely used and our level of exposure through various means is likely, how realistic is it that a chemical company will be able to phase out PFAS? And what does that mean, phase out?
Well, they're going to stop manufacturing it and selling it, which is a good thing. And they did make public a long list of the products that their PFAS is used in, which is quite useful to learn where it's used. They are one manufacturer, and the likely reason they're phasing it out is they made the PFAS that was used in firefighting foam by the military and at airports, and their liability is huge. All the communities that are contaminated around military bases and airports, once finally we say that PFAS are, they've been considered an unregulated contaminant, and they're being regulated. And once they're regulated, the lawsuits against 3M are so phenomenal that people think they may go bankrupt. So they are indeed phasing it out, which is great. But on the other hand, Chemours, who is equally culpable in North Carolina, is trying to double or triple their production at the very same time, which is awful. So, and Chemours, you'd think would have just many, many lawsuits too, but apparently not the extreme liability from the firefighting foam that 3M faces. It would be great if they all phased it out. Stop making it.
Dr. Schaider, Dr. Maffini, any other comments on phasing out of PFAS?
I could add that for the short chain PFAS used in contact with food, the 3 companies that were manufacturing those made an agreement with FDA that it would take them between 4 to 5 years to phase those products out. And it was in the middle of, not in the middle, at the beginning of COVID. So some of the reasons for such a long time to phase them out was, well, we don't want to further disrupt the supply chain in restaurants and takeout containers and those things that were so prevalent during COVID. So the agreement was that they will stop manufacturing, but they will continue supplying, basically go through their whole inventory, and that would take years, and then they will have to find something, a replacement for those uses, and that would take time, and that was the agreement. Even though FDA told them that the main issue was the bioaccumulation in the body, then the agency was very flexible in giving them 5 years to get rid of their inventory and find other ways to make the products.
Dr. Schaider?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say it is good news, but as Arlene said, there are other manufacturers here in the US and overseas, and maybe eventually they'll all phase out PFAS manufacturing, which will be great, but we'll still have a legacy for centuries, if not longer.
A bit of good news for drinking water is back in 2019 or 18, the military budget said that the military had to stop requiring all their firefighting foam to be PFAS. It used to, 3M wrote it. It was kind of crazy. It said firefighting foam has to be PFAS. And I know I wandered around telling people in the House and Senate, even Republicans or anybody saying, well, in America, other countries use non-fluorinated firefighting foam and they put out fires just fine. In America, if there's a firefighting foam that's 10 times as effective and costs 1/10 as much, we still have to use PFAS because that's our rule. And so the rule has changed. And this year, the military is going to move to non-fluorinated firefighting foam, which is going to reduce the local contamination, and civil airports are also going to follow suit. So in terms of drinking water, that's a big deal. 3M was the main supplier, so maybe they're not making as much money from it. They certainly have plenty of lawsuits from it. And at least that chapter is closing. But consumer products, the 3M list was kind of horrific, the things we've never thought of that have PFAS in them. So there's lots of work to be done, working with manufacturers. But the legislation that Laurel spoke about, like textiles, that's huge. The outdoor industry is finally going to have to move away from PFAS. So these state laws are making a huge difference in products, and we need more of them and more products to stop the use.
I want to thank all 3 of you so much for, again, this very informative panel. Because I like to leave on a positive note, because we have had a lot of information that may feel very weighty to the lay people in our audience and listening to this webinar. Some words of wisdom or hope that you'd like to leave the webinar so that folks feel that they do have some advocacy or empowered to protect themselves and protect their families.
I think this is really amazing, the extent to which PFAS has been recognized as a problem, and things are changing. We've been studying it for 10 years. In the first 6 or 7 years, nobody was really hardly aware of it, and everybody's aware of it. Dark waters, many things have helped. The great work being done in the States, encourage people. Laurel mentioned We have our website, our PFAS free list, Silent Spring. There are many resources for consumers to buy PFAS-free products, which helps their health and helps the manufacturers decide if they want to sell their products, they better remove the PFAS. So I actually feel some optimism that this is something that we're starting to deal with and learning things like what Maricel shared with us. You know, that was the mystery of where did the PFAS come from in the cosmetics. So that mystery is thanks to that work being solved. So anyway, I'm an optimist, and I think, you know, it's been remarkable the last 3 or 4 years how much progress is being made on PFAS.
I agree with Arlene. I think there is such a momentum, and so many millions of people are outraged by what happened in their communities that we are not letting it go. It's going to be 10 years. It's been 9 years since we submitted the first petition to FDA in 2014, and we got them to ban the long-chain PFAS in contact with food in a year. So by early 2016, they were out. So we continue. It's a long trek, but as Helen said, we have seen so much progress in the last few years that we just need to keep going.
Sure, and I'll build on what Arlene and Maricel said. I agree that, you know, it's been encouraging to see all the action by retailers and by state legislatures, and we often have been doing regrettable substitutions, and there was kind of the shift from the long chain to the short chain. It's been encouraging to see that many of the bills at the state level and the retailer action have really adopted the class-based concept that Arlene presented. It hasn't just been, okay, we'll phase out the short chains, now we'll move to other ones. I was worried that there'd be hopping within the class. There is a lot of buy-in into the class concept. So that's been really encouraging to see. And I think the other important thing that's coming down the pipeline this year is that EPA they have committed to finalizing their drinking water standards. So right now we have this patchwork where states like Massachusetts and about 12 or 13 others have enacted guidelines or standards. And so here in Massachusetts, we're learning that a lot of our water supplies have PFAS, and that's of course concerning for those communities, but that's important to know because then the water suppliers can take steps to put in treatment or find safer source waters. But in dozens of other states, there's not really any widespread testing. And even though the proposed standard will probably only include 2 PFAS chemicals, it will lead to all states doing testing of their water supplies. So it's going to be a lot of bad news, I think, as states are discovering the scope of the problem, but good news in that that they'll have to start doing testing and addressing the problem, and that will reduce people's exposures. So look for that coming. And I think the other important piece of news will be when PFAS get added as hazardous substances to Superfund, because that, even though again it's probably only going to be PFAS and PFOA, they do tend to show up most of the time when there's other PFAS chemicals, and that will be really important to speed up and fund remediation and cleanup of contaminated sites.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I want to thank all 3 of our very knowledgeable panelists, and thank you for the work that you are doing on behalf of all of us with your advocacy, your research, and your continued support in helping to educate legislators, the general population, and manufacturing in general. That is all the time we have for today. So I would like to again thank our panelists for providing all of this valuable information. And now I'd like to introduce MBCC's Executive Director, Cheryl Osimo. Cheryl, can you join us?
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Barbara. I want to thank our distinguished panel for being a part of today's very special 2nd annual Margo Simon Golden Memorial Webinar. Margo died on January 21st, 2021. Margo Golden was MBCC's board president for over a decade and was instrumental in shaping the organization that we know today. She had a vision for the role that Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition could play, not only for the citizens of Massachusetts, but for the greater good. Through her actions and advocacy, she paved the way to change the world for future generations. She is deeply missed by all who knew her and the community at large, but her legacy carries on. And I am now honored to introduce Attorney Andrew Golden, Margo's stepson, who's representing his family. Andrew has, in many, many ways, followed in Margo's footsteps in his role as an MBCC board member. Thank you, Andrew, and your entire family for your unwavering dedication and support. Andrew will present the second annual Margo Simon Golden Distinguished Service Award to Maria Vetrano and Helen Privett, founders of the Against the Tide Swim, Walk, Run event, an event that Margo felt passionate about and helped support in many ways. Andrew?
Thank you very much, Cheryl. I appreciate that very much. Certainly feels like the appropriate thing to say is that it's a privilege for both the Golden and the Simon combined families to participate in an annual event named in Margo's memory and to bestow an award with the purpose of recognizing kindness, dedication, and tireless determination that couldn't be named for a more fitting person. But I think I speak for all families who have lost someone to breast cancer when I say we would much rather have Margo with us than bestow any honor in her memory. It is almost exactly 2-year anniversary of Margo's passing, and the Golden and Simon families reflect on Margo every day. With us today, whether on camera, online, or in spirit, are Margo's devoted husband and my father, Neil, my brother, Craig, and me, her children in all ways that really count, her loving daughter-in-law, Kate, my wife, her grandsons, Ellis and Saul, who are in preschool today, but think about their nanny daily, her brothers, Donnie and Gary, Donnie's spouse and children, Susanna, Elena, and Eli, and countless cousins and in-laws and friends who will carry forward Margo's legacy for the rest of our lives. Margo's MBCC family, not least of all her dear, dear friend, Cheryl, our executive director, were immensely important to her. Many of her MBCC family, including members of the boards of directors who served with her, are with us today, putting in their own effort that helps sustain Margo's legacy. And a vital part of that legacy is the Margo Simon Golden Distinguished Service Award that it is my distinct honor to present today. Margo was a tireless leader and advocate for the organization, and I hope to live up to even a fraction of what she accomplished now that I sit on the board of directors. Those with the financial ability or inclination to do so are certainly encouraged to make a charitable donation to the Margo Simon Golden Fund at mbcc.org/tribute. The name of this award is the Margo Simon Golden Distinguished Service Award. This is no accident. Serve she did. Margo was first diagnosed with breast cancer in her late 30s. It did not take her very long to turn her focus to what she could do about it, how she could serve others, those diagnosed with breast cancer and those who might be saved from the diagnosis if the environmental causes and contributors to it were taken seriously and affirmatively addressed, largely dealing, for example, with the subject of our webinar today. Margo's service was an answer to this question, a question we each still ask all these years later. How can we prevent this? There are 2 women with us today who asked that question and who decided to do something in service of that goal. In 1993, Maria Vetrano and Helen Privett began the Against the Tide fundraising swim. The beneficiary of this event would be the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition, an advocacy organization which at that time only had 2 years of experience under its belt. Against the Tide continues to this day, as does the MBCC. The events in Hopkinton and Cape Cod, still known as Against the Tide, remain some of the most important fundraising and community advocacy that our organization does. Against the Tide's goal is not only to raise funds, it's also to raise spirits. Everyone who participates has an opportunity to be with others who have been through the struggle or who have family or friends who are or were impacted by breast cancer. At Against the Tide, participants share stories, they laugh, and yes, they cry. Many participate in memory of a loved one, but at least for one morning in Hopkinton or on Cape Cod, they are not alone. They know the people surrounding them understand their frustration with the status quo, and everyone knows they are helping in the battle to eradicate breast cancer. Against the Tide has given those struggling with this disease a place where they can feel involved, a place where they can both give and receive support, a place of joy and laughter and fulfillment, a place where the isolation of breast cancer does not exist. This is one of the reasons Against the Tide was one of Margo's most loved events in her roles with the organization. It was not in Margo's nature to simply reflect on illness. She wanted to do, to act, to serve. Against the Tide continues to be a wonderful venue for this. Maria and Helen, this legacy continues thanks to your ingenuity and desire to do and act and serve yourselves. And thank you for it. That is why Margo felt such a connection to this important event year after year. As the president of the board of directors for many years, Margo was a key organizer. I still remember well arriving at Hopkinton very, very, very early on several June mornings and seeing Margo and my dad organizing t-shirts. Margo, all smiles. I wish I could see her there again this year. Maria and Helen, on behalf of the MBCC and the Golden and Simon families, it is my distinct honor to present you with the second annual Margo Simon Golden Distinguished Service Award. Thank you, and if you wouldn't mind showing the award to those who are with us today, thank you very much. And we appreciate what you've done for this organization. The legacy lives on, and it's our pleasure to give you that award.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So I'm Maria, and first, both Helen and I want to say how honored we are to receive the Margo Simon Golden Distinguished Service Award. We've been involved with the MBCC for the last 30 years, watching the organization grow and progress in its mission to bring attention to the environmental causes of breast cancer that will lead to primary prevention of this still terrible disease. Some of you have heard my story before. My mother, Camille, died of breast cancer when I was 13 years old, when it was shameful for women living with breast cancer to talk about it, when treatments were barbaric and painful, and the environmental links to breast cancer had yet to be explored. It was devastating to see my mother suffer so greatly, particularly as there was little I could do to ease her suffering. With those memories in mind, Helen and I first dedicated our involvement in the MBCC to my mother and to mothers, sisters, spouses, wives, and aunts like her. 30 years ago, we were sitting on the shores of Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts, trying to think what we could do to help fight breast cancer. And we came up with the idea of a participatory fundraiser. Some 6 weeks later, with help from a small but very dedicated group of friends, we launched Against the Tide, the first fundraising swim to fight breast cancer in the country. With just 84 swimmers on an early summer morning, Against the Tide raised $14,000 for the MBCC. Helen and I actively ran the event until 1998, when we handed over the organization of Against the Tide to the MBCC, which has run it every year since. We stayed involved in the swim portion of Against the Tide for another decade. And year after year, we saw many of the same swimmers return, bringing their sons and daughters, partners, and husbands. Some of those swimmers are still swimming with us. Some of them have lost their lives to breast cancer, and some of their children still join us. It is a wonderful thing to experience. All those people combining their energies for a heartfelt cause. We so admire the ways in which the MBCC has taken Against the Tide to a whole new level, turning it into a true family event with swim, run, or walk options, and events in the Boston area and on Cape Cod, all of which make it more accessible to a wider number of people.
Maria and I were thinking back on and remembering what inspired us to start the swim in the first place. And that was Urvashi Bad. a lawyer and LGBTQ activist who gave a speech at the 1993 March on Washington for lesbian, gay, and bi equal rights and liberation, where she challenged everyone there to march from Washington into action at home. And where she said, don't just buy a t-shirt, but get involved. So Urvashi was talking specifically about supporting LGBTQ rights, but she probably didn't know that she inspired us to act, and probably never thought that 30 years later, her words would still have an impact. So anyway, Urvashi and her words inspired these two women to create the Against the Tide swim. And unfortunately, Urvashi died in March of 2022 of breast cancer, and probably never knowing that she was a spark that got us motivated. We would like to dedicate this award to Urvashi and pay it forward. We ask that everyone or anyone watching this recording, that you take action. Support the MBCC. Swim, walk, run, volunteer, contact your state and federal representatives and challenge corporations who reap profits from products that contain carcinogens. And make your cities and states clean up their water supplies. Take action, get involved, make changes, as Margo Simon Golden did throughout her life. And we're really honored to receive this reward in her name. And we want to thank you. And we apologize for our dog snoring.
Most of us have a pooch near us or nearby. Thank you so much, Maria and Helen, for being here with us. And you know how Margo felt about you. On behalf of the entire Golden Simon families, Dr. Barbara Malkas, the entire board of directors, MBCC staff and supporters, we would like to thank our distinguished panelists, Dr. Arlene Blum, Dr. Laurel Schaider, Dr. Maricel Maffini, and all attendees for participating in the second annual Margo Simon Golden Memorial Webinar. I know that Margo would be proud of her entire family and the fact that Andrew was able to present the award to Maria and Helen. Congratulations, Maria and Helen. Margo, Maria, and Helen have always had something in common. They have never wavered in their dedication to breast cancer prevention. Margo, we love you. I'm sorry, everyone. Thank you for joining us.